In the year 1890, 2 out of every 5 Irish-born people were living abroad. 2 out of every 5, 40%, most of them here in the United States. The historian David Fitzpatrick described emigration as a relentlessly nationally organized machine.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, even sometimes in ways that people rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies at University College Dublin.
I'm Scott Lucas, journalist, political analyst, and professor of U.S. and international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Kevin Kenny. Kevin is Professor of History and Glucksman Professor in Irish Studies at New York University. He's a distinguished immigration historian, author of several prized books in the field, beginning with Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, all the way through to his most recent one, Rituals of Migration, Italians and Irish on the Move. His current research examines U.S. immigration history in the long 19th century.
Join us as Kevin looks at the mass migrations from Ireland to the U.S. in the 19th century. We'll try to understand who was migrating, why they were migrating, what the journey was like, where they settled in the United States, and how they contributed to the making of America.
Welcome, Kevin. It's great to see you. And we really now want to get into a conversation about immigration into the United States, and we're focusing on the 19th century and taking that forward. And Kevin, a lot of our viewers and listeners might think we're going to start with the Irish famine. Very important. We'll talk about it, but we need to go back a bit earlier.
Thank you, Liam. It's great to be with you. Look, the conventional starting point for the story of Irish America is 1845 and the Great Famine. It's the one event I think that everybody knows about. There's a long history before that. It goes back into the colonial period, into the 18th century. But the key to the Irish immigration, the key period is roughly from the 1820s to the 1920s. I want to, even before we go into that, just start with a few numbers because they're really pretty staggering. This migration to North America and to the United States is the central component of an even larger movement that we now call today the Irish Diaspora. Just to give you some figures, 10 million men, women, and children left the island of Ireland since 1700. The population today is just over 7 million. The population of the country, north and south, the island, reached its historical peak in 1845 at 8.5 million. We're still not back there, right? So that's if we frame what we're about to talk about in that context, the key movement is the movement of the Irish across the Atlantic to North America and then to the present-day United States. So we can break down what we're going to call the long 19th century, from the turn of the 19th century through about the 1920s. We can break that down into 3 periods. And I think it's very important that we start with, we're going to call the first period the pre-famine era. Then we have the well-known famine migration, and then we have a post-famine period. So let me just talk about the first of those periods, and then I think we'll get into the famine in greater detail. So the first period we're talking about is the generation leading up to the famine. Nobody knew the famine was coming, but mass migration was already underway. And we estimate that somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Irish people crossed the Atlantic in that generation leading up to the famine. That would be roughly 1820 to 1845.
Just ask you about that, Kevin, because I think many people will be curious about why those numbers are so big before the famine. What is pushing them? Why are they moving at that point in time?
What's pushing Irish emigration throughout the period we're going to be talking about, what we call the long 19th century, is population growth combined with access to land. I choose that second phrase carefully, but the land question is key. Let's start with population growth. The population of Ireland grew exponentially from about the middle of the 18th century to the famine period. And by that I mean it doubled and it doubled again. So there's roughly 1 million people there at the start of the 18th century, then 2 million, then 4 million, then 8 million. Actually, the rate of population growth was slowing slightly before the famine. Again, the famine was not inevitable. We'll get to the famine. But there were a lot of people on a small island. The population of Ireland and the population of England were roughly the same at the beginning of the 19th century. Both populations began to grow. Now, the land question is critical. And I studied this subject for a long time when I was in graduate school before the penny dropped. And when the penny dropped, it made a very loud sound in my mind, because people didn't own their land. What they were competing for was access to land as tenant farmers. There were so in a situation where the population is growing exponentially, and people are not owning the land outright, they're renting it from other people. Not always absentee landlords in London or Dublin, but from people above them in the social hierarchy. Getting access to land is the key issue. Now, oddly enough, it's precisely the potato that allows people to stay on the land, because you can feed a family of the potato. It's highly nutritious. You can feed a family if you have access to 1/4 of an acre of land. You can grow enough potatoes to feed a family. Nobody knew that the potato was going to fail entirely. And so potato cultivation facilitated subdivision of the land and allowed the population to stay. So although people were beginning to leave in the context of poverty and access to land, they would have left in even bigger numbers if they didn't have access to that food source. The second key thing about this pre-famine period is that it's during I'd say the 1830s that we see the switch in the demographic composition of the emigration flow from predominantly Protestant, and that was mainly Presbyterian, to predominantly Catholic. And from the 1830s onwards, about 90% of the outflow consists of Catholics. But for a long time before that, throughout the 18th century, it had been primarily Protestant. So you see that switch starting in the 1830s. Thereafter, migration to British North America, today Canada, remains heavily Protestant, but the Irish America that is known today in popular culture, the Catholic Irish America of the Kennedys and now the Bidens, that's a creation that comes into place in this pre-famine period.
So that's a really important distinction to make. In a sense, our understanding of Irish America, I think in Ireland, often begins with the 19th century, but as you're observing, there's a very Protestant Ireland or Irish America in the 18th. So let's focus on the 19th. The Catholics are now coming in large numbers. We're not quite at the famine yet. How are they traveling? Where are they traveling from?
Starting in the 1830s, I would say, you have the beginnings of what you would call a business of immigration, where ships are fitted out for the first time for the passenger trade. And it becomes a major part of American commerce then over the course of the 19th century. Thinking about what it was like to cross the Atlantic, back in the 18th century, if you got really bad weather, it could take 3 months. But right up through the late 19th century, it could take 4 to 6 weeks on rough sea. And it depended, the conditions on board depended a lot on where you left from. So if you were leaving on a small ship from the west of Ireland or from Moville up near Derry, it would take longer and conditions would be likely to be rougher. Eventually, by the time the famine comes in the 1840s, the port of Liverpool had become the major entrepot for immigrants as well as for trade. The last thing I want to say on that point, because we sometimes forget the obvious, right? And we can't see what it was just like on a daily basis for the people involved. These were sailing ships. Even during the famine, you had the introduction of steamships, but only across the Irish Sea to Liverpool for short journeys. You had steamships. So even during the Great Famine exodus, which we're about to get to, people were traveling on sailing ships that could take up to 6 weeks in rough weather to get across the Atlantic.
Kevin, just a basic question for me as I learn about this. And in terms of from where these people were coming on the Irish island, 18th century, my understanding is a lot of them had come from the north of Ireland, the Ulster Scots. Is it a relatively even spread now by this period that they're coming from all parts of the Irish island?
It's still not relatively evenly spread until later in the 19th century. When we talk about the post-famine period, we can say, if you like, that the floodgates have opened. But the period we're talking about, the floodgates begin to open during the famine. Well, anybody gets out who can get out. But we're still on the pre-famine period here. And what I'll say is that we know that in the 18th century, up through about the 1820s, the opening decades of the 19th century, that 3/4 of the emigrants were Protestant and 3/4 of them were Presbyterians from the northern province of Ulster. That's the earlier pattern. If we look at the what we're calling the pre-famine generation, 1815 to 1845, you get the beginnings, as I said, of mass Catholic emigration, but it's still coming from particular places. It's not coming yet from the west of Ireland, by and large. The west of Ireland is the poorest part of the country. It's also the part of the country where families are most likely to subdivide the land. It's not high quality land, but you can grow potatoes on it. And the great historian of this subject, Kirby Miller, with his thesis of emigration as exile, it's been much discussed in the 40 years since he published it. But Miller is correct to say that people don't want to emigrate if they can avoid doing so in the pre-famine period. And there is a sense of emigration as something unwelcome, as a form of exile or banishment. And what that means is during this period, relatively few, I would say relative to later periods, relatively few immigrants are leaving the impoverished west of Ireland. The highest rates of emigration, if we get very precise about it, are in two parts of Ireland: north central, that's the borderlands between the provinces of Leinster and Ulster, and south central, the borderlands between the provinces of Leinster and Munster. Why? In the first case, because of the decline of the rural linen industry, the mechanization of that industry. In other words, it went into factories. A lot of people had depended on growing flax, spinning yarn as a domestic industry. So we can trace it to that in the north central part of the country. In the south central part of the country, that's the part with the best land, where you're most likely to have commercialized farming. If I were to summarize the motor cause of Irish emigration thereafter, I could tell you that it's the replacement of people with animals on the land. So driving people away from access to the land, turning the land over to commercial farming by putting cattle and sheep on it, right? So interestingly, if you go down in the weeds as we are here now, you will find that the two parts of the country that are producing most emigrants are the two that have most experience with commercial agriculture or domestic industry.
That moves us then into the famine period, where the patterns are going to change very abruptly and very traumatically for quite obvious reasons. We're dealing with an ecological catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe. Some would say maybe also a policy catastrophe, if we wish to talk about that, Kevin. But we really want to think about what's its impact on immigration. There are some staggering figures around that as well. Could you just share us a little bit of the big picture view of what does the famine mean for immigration?
It's very important to understand anything about Irish history, including the emigration. I think that we distinguish here between two things. One is crop failure, and the other is famine. They're not the same thing. In other words, if a crop fails, does a population have to starve? That's the historical question. To answer that question, you actually have to do something that's difficult and unpleasant, which is to enter into the history of the famine itself. When we encounter catastrophe on this scale, there's a tendency to recoil from the horror of it and just to see it as this terrible, undifferentiated thing. But the famine had a history, right? And I want to talk about that in order to explain the emigration that occurred. So in 1845, the potato crop failed. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody could have foreseen in 1845 that the entire crop would have failed. 5 million people were dependent on the potato. About 3.5 million of them had no other source of food, right? So the entire crop failed in 1845, and we have to think of this as the world being turned upside down. The cycles of nature had just ceased to perpetuate themselves as people had expected. So naturally, people wondered, what is happening? Scientists didn't determine what was happening until about the 1870s, that this was a fungal infestation that was spreading in the unusually damp conditions of Ireland with a vulnerable population. So people said, what is happening? The rural poor wondered if it was their fault, if they had done something wrong in the past, if they had grown so many potatoes in previous seasons and not even used them, if they had been wasteful. People in government, especially in the British establishment, also invoked the intervention of God to say that this was actually a stroke of providence. That God was intervening in the Irish question. The Irish question is poverty and overpopulation. God was intervening, and perhaps we should let history run its course. So if you want to look at the actual history of the famine, you have to look at policies that were taken or not taken. And these involved the distribution of food at cost, price, or for free. It involved public works. It involved eventually saying, no, this is a local problem. The Irish should take care of their own poverty. We have a mechanism called the Poor Law for doing this. So we need to get into that history to understand how and why a demographic catastrophe, the starvation and death by disease, occurred on the scale that it did. So in 1845, as there were 8.5 million people living on the island. In 1855, we take the decade as the unit of measurement, there were 5.8 million. So from 8.5 million to 5.8 million. It's a demographic catastrophe without parallel in modern European history. At least 1 million people died. We don't know the exact number because nobody was in a room writing these things down. We don't know the exact number of people who died during COVID. It's the only parallel that we have, right, in the contemporary world. So we actually have to look at what the population was, the rate at which it was growing, subtract the number that we know emigrated, and we get at a mortality figure. And that mortality figure is somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million. Irish people died during that decade. In addition, 2.1 million left the island. Now, 3/4 of them came to the United States of America. So that figure of 2 million emigrating in the decade from 1845 to 1855, That's more than had left the entire island up to that point in the period since 1700. So the famine is absolutely critical. And those are the numbers and the internal history. We can go now, Liam, into the structure of the emigration, if you wish.
No, that would be good, but the scale is phenomenal. And then, of course, the scale of emigration is phenomenal as well here. So similar questions about the earlier movement. Which parts of Ireland are people moving from in the greater numbers? And where are they moving to in the United States when they arrive?
So I would say during the famine catastrophe, as many people get out of Ireland as they can, right, which means you will have people leaving from all parts of Ireland. There's a significant gender dimension to this, because in the pre-famine period, like most mass emigrations, the majority were male. Then that's a general rule in emigration history for the onset of mass movements. So in the pre-famine period, 2 out of 3 emigrants were young men. The sex ratios in migration begin to even out during the famine, because everybody will leave if they can leave, right? And that gender pattern accentuates in the late 19th century, and we need to return to that because it's very significant. But what I will say also is that among those of us who study mass migration, there's another general rule, which is that the poorest of the poor don't leave because they can't afford to leave. And that's true across the board when we study migration. But think of that in the context of famine. What's going to happen to the poorest of the poor? Well, if they can't leave, they're most likely to die. So you're going to get the highest rates of mortality again in the west of Ireland. The lowest quality land, the most impoverished parts of the island, the parts where your large families are trying to subsist on small plots of land. So you're going to get the highest rates of mortality, and sometimes therefore an inverse relationship between mortality and migration in places like West Cork, West Clare, some of the worst scenes of mortality. But people are beginning to leave the west of Ireland if they can, and they're leaving from all over the island, including from Ulster during the famine. Where are they coming to? Well, by this time, partly because of the pre-famine emigration, New York City has become the main destination. Boston is also important. Philadelphia is important. New Orleans is important still. But New York City is on the American side what Liverpool has become on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's the connection between Liverpool and New York that is critical. Now, we also have to figure out how were people able to emigrate if they chose to do so, and they're choosing to do so in very large numbers because of the famine. And, you know, again, the poorer the region in Ireland, the less likely people are to be involved even in a cash economy. They might be paying their rent by doing labor for somebody else, or they might raise one farm animal and sell it in order to pay the rent. A lot of them had no access to resources except one critical source, and this becomes the key to migration, and that's money that's being sent back from America. So the scale of emigrant remittances is staggering. Even among the famine Irish, they start to send money back straight away to bring other people out. And it generates a phenomenon that we refer to as chain migration, whereby one member of the family, it might be not the eldest daughter, because she might have a prospect of marriage at home, but it might be the next daughter would come out to New York, get work as a domestic servant, send money back to bring another brother or sister out. This is going to be definitive of the structure of post-famine emigration, this whole phenomenon of chain migration and remittances.
And if we think for a minute then, before we get into the settlement in the United States, Kevin, of the travel, you've mentioned before, the travel across the Atlantic for the pre-famine generation. For the famine generation, it didn't get any easier, did it? This was a very tough journey for many.
It's a very tough journey because there are rudimentary passenger laws that are in place, British passenger laws and American passenger laws that are beginning to figure out the dimensions of space on a vessel, how much crowding or overcrowding you can do, and the basic requirements for sustenance in terms of food and water and other supplies that are mandated on vessels. These things are hard to enforce, but with the rise of the passenger trade, you have some degree of regulation. But these are starving bodies that are being placed in these conditions, and starving bodies are prone to disease. And so the rates of mortality on board ship are shocking. I'm going to say maybe not as shocking as we might expect them to be, and I need to parse my words carefully there. Here I'm going to quote the work of a superb recent historian, Cian McMahon, who wrote a book called The Coffin Ship. And Cian looked at life on board vessels, and he did two things. And here I'm just quoting the authorities, so I'll turn to Cian. The first thing he did was he looked at the rates of shipboard mortality. And the second very interesting thing he did was he looked at the creation of community on board ships, even among the most adverse of conditions. So let me touch on both points. There's, in the late 19th century, the figure of the coffin ship is invoked in nationalist discourse as a critique of British misrule of Ireland. And there's a supposition that about 25% of all Irish emigrants on board ship during the famine perished. So the mortality rate was, 20 to 25%. That's actually an exaggeration. And what, by looking at closely at the figures, what Cian McMahon discovered was the mortality rate was actually about 2 or 3%. It was not exceptionally high, except in certain circumstances. This is something that historians love to zoom in on the particular and look at specific circumstances. There were two circumstances under which famine mortality, shipboard mortality was shockingly high. One was on vessels that left from the west of Ireland, small vessels that didn't go through the more conventional Liverpool trade. And the other was in the year 1847. We know the year 1847 in popular lore as Black 47. There's a band here in New York City called Black 47. The irony with Black 47 is that the potato crop in Ireland was relatively healthy that year, but it was a small crop, and so people still didn't have enough food. The British government used the pretext of a healthy crop to abandon famine relief and place it on the poor law. But the irony is that shipboard mortality was terribly high that year in particular places, including the quarantine facility of Gros Isle, just north of Montreal. There's a novella by Anita Shreve called Ship Fever that captures what happened there better than any history source I know. And so as historians, we always have to look at the twists and turns and the contingencies. And it just so happened in 1847 that legislation at the federal level and the state level in the United States made it more expensive to cross the Atlantic to New York City, and a lot of the traffic was diverted north. And to visualize the tragedy of diseased and starving bodies in 1847, leaving Ireland, trying to resettle elsewhere, We have gross eel and the burial of, I think, about 12,000 people on that island, a quarantine station, really as a vivid memory. So the point here is not to diminish or underestimate by saying that the general rate was not 25%. The point is to look at the tragedies where it did reach that level. But the second part of the famine migration, and this again is the power of Cian McMahon's work, is when we do immigration history, there's often a missing link. In other words, we look at conditions at home in Ireland, then we pick up the story again when people get to New York or Boston. But what Cian McMahon does is he looks at the journey itself. And the subtitle of that book is Life and Death at Sea during the famine. And what he finds is that even in the face of great adversity, tragedy, starvation, and mortality, that Irish people began to build the connections on board that led to the creation of communities then on this side of the Atlantic in New York. And remember, when we say Irish people, you could have an Irish family from Cork, an Irish family from Cavan, an Irish family from Donegal. How much did they actually have in common as Irish people until they came together? And in immigration history, we often talk about the coming together in New York or Boston, but that process of coming together and recognition, mutual recognition as something more than local, but as Irish and as famine Irish, is actually starting on board the vessels.
I think that's remarkable, and we'll be sure to make a reference to Cian's research as well as your own research and scholarship and links to this podcast. One of the things that strikes me about what you were saying is the ways in which memory becomes really important here to the build-up, not just of immigration, but of what you also call the diaspora. The famine itself surely becomes an exceptionally important part of that, doesn't it, within Irish-American memory? In other words, it becomes part of the collective memory of what it means to be an immigrant and be Irish in America.
Absolutely. So I'd say that the famine is the foundational moment, I might say the foundational myth in the generation of Irish-American ethnic identity. And when I say myth, I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean just a structure of meaning and memory that arises surrounding a particular event. And so it's not for nothing, as they say, that Irish-American history, we still generally believe it started in 1845. Right? We know it didn't, and we know the earlier history is very important, but the experience of famine, migration, dislocation, suffering, tragedy, trauma is built into the structure of what it means to be Irish-American from 1845 onwards.
Let's take it into the settlement then of the famine Irish and move forward into the post-famine period as well, into that third period that you started talking about a bit earlier. As they settle, again, what's the key geography? We know they're settling in cities primarily, but can you tell us a little bit about what that means? Because they come together in very communal ways. The church clearly has a lot to do with this, and this provides the basis for entry into parts of the American economy in really interesting ways. And they begin to build power bases quite quickly, don't they?
Yes, indeed. And again, let's begin with some numbers because it's really staggering. So Ireland is a small place. It's about the size of Maine or South Carolina. It had a population of 8.5 million, which was sizable in 1845, but it's still small compared to the population of the United States. But here are the figures. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Irish accounted for up to 45% of all immigrants.
Wow.
So almost half of immigrants in the decade of the 1840s, 45% were Irish. It was still as high as 33% in the 1850s when the Germans began to outnumber the Irish. So this small country, geographically and demographically, is accounting for almost half of the foreign-born people coming into the United States in the 1840s. What that means is if you look at the census and if you stop the clock in 1850 or 1860, you've got a federal census, and you look at the main areas of settlement, and we just start with New York and Boston now, and we can flesh that out. But if you look at the census, what you're going to discover is that 1 in every 4 New Yorkers was Irish born in 1850 and 1860, 1 in every 4. And that's not even counting their American-born children. The same is true in Boston, and in Philadelphia, it's about 16%. So it's a massive impact. And we're going to get into anti-immigrant sentiment and nativism in a little bit. People saw the Irish everywhere in the urban centers, and they didn't always like what they were seeing. So if we look at the overall pattern, it's fair to say throughout the 19th century, from this period right through the end, that the Irish settle primarily in 4 states and with their corresponding cities. Those states are New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Illinois. California becomes the 5th. California is always an outlier when you look at the census because so many people live in California today. When we look at college figures and say how many of our students come from wherever, California is always going to be up there because California is huge. But even in the 19th century, Irish were moving to California. So the cities, and this is actually, the pattern is interesting. The cities are New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. New Orleans remains important, and there's small but significant movement in other southern ports too. But the big 5 are the 5 I've given you, and I've given them to you in that order for a reason. So New York is always biggest, just because it is the biggest city. Most Irish people come to New York, and then even if only 13 or 15% of them stay, that's a percentage of a huge number, right? So you're going to have the largest number of Irish-born people is going to be in New York. The second largest, in the period we're talking about, the second largest is going to be Philadelphia. The third largest is going to be Boston, even though Boston is the most Irish of all the cities, I think, by reputation. The numbers are smaller, right? So the percentage is higher in Boston, but the gross numbers are smaller. And then you have Chicago. So just in terms of aggregate numbers, not percentages, you're going to have New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. New Orleans is always important. You have substantial migration also to British North America, present-day Canada, and Canada tends to attract Protestant Irish disproportionately throughout the century. But a lot of the famine Irish end up in Canada. We've mentioned this in 1847 as well. And then they trek overland down into the Northeast or into the Midwest. So that's the kind of big demographic pattern at mid-century.
Okay, and on the basis of that settlement, especially into the big cities, as you say, what are the sort of foundational roles that the Irish moved into to get a foothold on the urban economy and the urban polity?
We'll have to start with labour, and then we'll do politics and religion. So there's 3 nice topics for the Irish dinner table, right? So let's start with labour, and we have to think of the Irish in the Atlantic world. This includes Britain as well as the United States, really as what Marx at the time would have, Marx and Engels would have referred to the Irish as a mobile proletariat. These were the working people who built the infrastructure of industry and cities, or who served in the houses of the middle and upper middle class. So to the extent that the Irish term, as indeed I would say the English, for a labourer is a paddy, and the Irish American term for a domestic servant is a Bridget. So we have to start with the Paddies and the Bridgets. And the Irish men built things, they destroyed things, and they carried things. So they built the urban infrastructure, they built the canals, they built the railroads, they worked underground in the coal mines when they moved out of the cities. They worked in the cities as doing the heavy manual labor of digging and hauling and carrying, breaking down and building up. Irish women moved so disproportionately into domestic service that by the turn of the 20th century, something like 70% of all New York servants were Irish. So that's how they started out. Sticking on the question of labor and social mobility before we get to politics and religion, the supposition for a long time among historians would have been that the Irish started out that way and they remained that way for several generations in America, and that there's ongoing poverty and discrimination and alienation on that basis. And again, I think recent historians have chipped away at that and seen that as what is sometimes referred to as the doom and gloom school of Irish American historiography. It's the American, the counterpart on this side of the exile thesis as an interpretation of emigration. And, most recently, Tyler Anbinder, the historian, has he's written a book called Plentiful Country, in which he actually does the primary source work that historians do. He looks at city directories, he looks at savings bank records, and he discovers pretty remarkable social mobility even among the famine generation. And that's before we even get to the children, right, the American-born children, because that's going to be the real test. But even among the famine generation, and we've kind of suspected this for a while, because once the emigrant savings bank records opened up here in New York over the last generation, we discovered that ostensibly poor and desperate and dissolute Irish people were sending tons of money back to Ireland to fund chain migration. And then archaeologists began to do excavation in places like Five Points to look at the material culture. They said, look, these guys had really fancy china and glassware and the rest of it. This just doesn't quite match the image of Five Points that we get from Charles Dickens. So Five Points was this notorious slum in Lower Manhattan, which was regarded from the outside as a den of iniquity and a center of vice and prostitution and crime. And there's plenty of that, but it wasn't just that. And again, it gets back to memory, because much of what we understand about that Five Points district comes from Dickens's book, American Notes. And it's all hyped up. So we've known for a while that there was more going on than that, just through the fact of chain migration, the archaeological digs. And then what Anbinder was able to establish was that even the famine generation, that a lot of Irish ended up, making a lot of money and moving occupationally up from laborer into, say, self-employed businessman. Now, the real test for social mobility is what happens to their American-born children. And the American-born children of the famine Irish get jobs in municipal government. They get jobs in the police force. And they start to get jobs as plumbers and carpenters and artisans and mechanics. And we have to understand that the pre-famine and famine Irish were coming into America without marketable skills in an industrial economy. And their children did acquire those skills. The daughters of the domestic servants didn't stay in domestic service. So the women went into domestic service for a while. Once they married, they were out of domestic service. Their daughters became nurses and school teachers. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, we see that pattern of social mobility. But sticking on this point of how the Irish achieved a foothold, the other two areas have to do with religion and politics. And I think it's fair to say that two national institutions, and only those two institutions, opened their doors wide to the Irish. And those institutions were the Democratic Party and the Catholic Church. And the Irish not only accepted the welcome, they took over both institutions. So they started on the municipal and urban level. The Democratic Party machine in New York City, known as Tammany Hall, became the center of Irish power from the 1870s onwards. And the Catholic Church, as the saying goes, became one holy Catholic, apostolic, and Irish in America, to the extent that the Irish clergy and hierarchy dominated that institution until the very recent past. So a combination of social mobility, the political and religious dimension. Now, in saying all of that, I am in no way denying the prejudice that the Irish encountered in the United States. So much so, if we just take the religious example, I heard it once said that anti-Catholicism remained an intellectually respectable form of bigotry in the United States until 1960. In 1960, John F. Kennedy explained that I am not the Catholic candidate for president of the United States. I am the Democratic candidate who happens to be a Catholic. He killed that question, right? It was really very, very effective what he did. It was not a question with Joe Biden, can a Catholic become president of the United States? But anti-Catholicism as a respectable form of bigotry remained live and well in the United States well into the second half of the 20th century. On the political front, the Irish started by controlling city politics, and then by the mid-20th century were moving into very prominent roles in national politics.
Kevin, you've taken us up onto the cusp of the 20th century, and I think that really what you've done is given us a lot of foundations for episodes to come at the same time, and that's wonderful. But we would like to take a little time on the 20th century and into the 21st, because the patterns of migration do change significantly once we get to the 1920s onwards. What causes this very significant change?
Again, like a good historian, I'm going to go back slightly in the past to explain that, because we have talked in this conversation a lot about the Irish in America once they get there. We haven't zeroed in yet on what I call the post-famine period, right? So just very briefly, if we look at the long 19th century, 1820s to 1920s, we've looked at the pre-famine period, we've looked in depth at the famine period, but the largest wave of migration of all is in the post-famine period. And we define the post-famine period, this is before we get to the 20th century proper, it's a long 19th century. We define the post-famine period as 1855 to 1920s. And during that period, more than 4 million Irish come to America. Emigration during that period becomes an expected part of the life cycle of any Irish person, as it did again late in the 20th century, right? And what I mean by that is when young Irish people got to the age that my students are now, roughly 20, 21, they knew that they would be grappling with the decision, do I go or can I stay? Do I go or can I stay? In the year 1890, 2 out of every 5 Irish-born people were living abroad. 2 out of every 5, 40%, most of them here in the United States. So, the historian David Fitzpatrick described emigration as a relentlessly nationally organized machine in the second half of the 19th century. And what he meant by that partly was that children were being raised as potential emigrants. And we have to face that because in the post-famine period, Irish men and women marry late. They marry later than most Western Europeans. In the pre-famine period, they had married young, in their early 20s. In the post-famine period, they're marrying late in their early 30s, roughly where we are today, but that was late for that period, right? So they had the latest ages of marriage and the latest and the highest rates of what demographers call permanent celibacy, which is non-marriage, in Western Europe. And this is all because of the famine, right? The old system of subdividing the land and the fear of the workhouse and all of that. But marital fertility remained extraordinarily high. So the average family size was still 6 children. Now, in a situation where you still have access over scarce land and you can't subdivide the holding anymore for fear of famine, well, what's going to happen to those 6 children? The eldest 2 might stay if the daughter got a dowry and the son could consolidate a landholding through marriage. 1 or 2 might join religious orders and go abroad. And 1 or 2 or 3 might emigrate. Now, when they emigrated, it was mainly to America, and they did so with the expectation that they would send money back home. So you could see migration by young women in particular in this period as, in one sense, a form of liberation, not exile, getting away from the stultifying constraints of a rural society, but also you could see it as the extension of family and patriarchal control, because they went in the expectation that they would send money back, and it was typically the daughters who did. It's very important in this period to understand that sex ratios, that's male, female, just counting those categories among migrants, are 50-50. And not only that, the half of the emigrants who are female are mostly young and single. And this is highly distinctive. You only have to think of Colm Tóibín's novel Brooklyn in the 1950s to see what I'm talking about. No Italian woman could have done what the heroine does in Brooklyn. A young Italian woman couldn't have gone out in the piazza without a chaperone, let alone got on a transatlantic ship, right? So these are, among Jewish, sex ratios are close to equal, but the women are traveling in family groups and with their brothers and sisters or as husbands. The Irish case, it's 50-50, and these young women are traveling on their own. It's extraordinary, and it prefigures patterns of international migration in the world today. Okay, so you got this massive wave that we call the post-famine migration. It comes to an end in the 1920s. Why is the question, and that's going to take us into what we'll call the short 20th century, right? And migration for the rest of that period and then today. Well, it's very convenient when you're a historian to look for chronological markers, and the period we use is 1855 to, let's say, 1924, or 1921. We'll say 1921. 1855 makes sense because that's the end of the famine decade. We use the decade because the situation stabilizes in 1855. 1921 does not make sense. 1921 is a political marker. It's not a marker in social history. And what we're talking about in mass migration is a massive social movement. We choose 1921 for 2 reasons. One is Irish independence or autonomy at the end of the War of Independence and the creation of the Free State. And the other is immigration restriction in the United States. So it's a nice kind of set of markers for periodization. The reason it doesn't work is that emigration continues. So let me just dwell on the 2 markers. So in the Irish case, it's a political and constitutional development. So, okay, there's an end of a period of migration. Problem is migration continues. About 2 million people leave north and south over the remainder of the 20th century. But migration is diverted. The United States ceases to be the main location. So migration is diverted once again to Britain And there had been ongoing migration in the 19th century as well. So you might think then on this side of the Atlantic that the reason for that is immigration restriction. So in 1921 and 24, the United States passes immigration restriction laws that drastically reduce the number of immigrants coming from about 1 million to 150,000, and that curtail Asian immigration altogether, and that discriminate among European immigrants. And the way that is done is that immigrants from Southeast Europe, Italian, Slavs, and Jewish, receive a very small quota, and immigrants from Northwest Europe receive a large quota. So far, so good, but Ireland is in Northwest Europe. And so through this quota system, the Irish, if you like, achieve respectability through the back door by default. Because people had not liked the Irish. We haven't talked much about nativism. They had not liked the Irish in the 19th century, but now, lo and behold, the Irish are right up there with the Norwegians, much loved by Donald Trump. So Ireland gets a generous quota in the 1920s, but it doesn't fill the quota. So it's about 54,000 places, I believe, from memory, available. They don't fill the quota. Instead, the migration stream begins to divert to England and Scotland, and then that is accentuated by two major developments in world history: the Great Depression in the 1930s, when there's nothing to come here for, and World War II, which breaks down the possibility of traveling across the Atlantic, even if there is employment, right? So you have the diversion of the migrant stream primarily to Britain. In the 1950s, Irish emigration once again reaches, an astonishingly high level. It's almost as high as as a rate of emigration as during the famine. Almost 500,000 Irish people leave the island in the 1950s, and the population of the Republic dips to 2.9 million. I mean, it's just staggering. Among the people who left in the 1950s were my own parents. So they left Ireland and they came to New York City by ship, and they moved to Montreal in Canada. And that's where my two eldest siblings were born. And then they did something unusual, which is they returned to Ireland. Return migration among the Irish traditionally is very, very low. The Irish and the Jewish have the lowest rates of return among European immigrants earlier in the 20th century. So they did something unusual. They returned because in the 1960s and 1970s, for the first time since the famine, the Irish population began to grow rather than decline. It had been in a steady decline ever since the famine, began to grow, and part of the growth was fueled actually by returned migrants like my parents. In the 1980s, I left Ireland, along with so many people I know, and when I meet people here and say, when did you leave? They left in 1986, so did I. I'm an unusual immigrant in the sense that I came here to do my PhD, and I stayed. I didn't come with the intention necessarily of being an immigrant, but typical in another way, which is that so many people left in the 1980s. And I remember I was one of 5 close friends at that time. And we live today, 1 in England, 2 in America, 2 in Australia. It's not atypical. I'm one of 6 children, and we live in 5 different countries. 2 in the United States, 1 in New Zealand, 1 in Spain, 1 in Canada, and 1 in Ireland. And so the story continues throughout the 20th century. I think mass emigration is the defining characteristic of Irish history in the modern period. The framing is that it's all these absentee landlords in London who are causing it. So what happens then after 1921? Logically, with the end of imperial misrule, emigration should stop. But it continues at the same relentless pace. So who do you blame then? You could If you're in government, you could blame yourself. That's not likely to happen. You could blame it on the materialist allure of the neighboring island, or, most troubling to me, you could blame it on the emigrants and say that they had somehow done something wrong by leaving.
If we look at the immigration patterns now in the 21st century, as we move to close off this episode, well, there's not a lot of movement into the United States, is there?
There's not a lot of movement, and there's even less this year and last year. If I talk about Irish America today and the future of Irish America, there's great anxiety and soul searching going on in the United States because something old is dying. The classic Irish America, maybe the classic Irish America is still the Irish America of the Kennedys and the Democrats and the Catholic Church. It's all changing, and something is missing. And what's missing is, firstly, replenishment through ongoing immigration. Less than 10% of all immigrants in the United States today are European. The rest are from Asia and Latin America, mostly. So less than 10% European. And the number of Irish people coming historically is tiny compared to what it was. So you don't have the replenishment in that sense. And you don't have, or hadn't until recently, a unifying political cause. Like the Troubles was a unifying political cause, even if perspectives on what was going on at home were truncated by distance. It was something that different constituencies could rally around, and whether that was for peaceful constitutional change or hardline republicanism, it was a galvanizing force. Brexit is too confusing to be that. The prospect of national reunification, or a debate over national reunification in Ireland, obviously could have a galvanizing effect. But people justifiably today then worry about what is Irish America anymore? What is Irish American ethnicity? Is it kind of diluting into what sociologists would call a symbolic ethnicity, where it doesn't have substance? Are we talking about ethnic fade? With the Irish do better and better in America, do they cease to be meaningfully Irish? I actually would, unusually for me, take a fairly optimistic stance on that question. Again, by virtue of the work I do here in New York, I tap into so much energy and enthusiasm among the younger generation. And not so much Irish born or necessarily even Irish American by descent as Irish affiliated in a broader way. And what they're especially interested in is the music and the literature and the politics of Northern Ireland. That's what we're picking up on. And interestingly, the language. So the language revival that's taking place at home is actually manifested here in New York and in Boston and other American cities. And so what I have always thought as a historian is that ethnicity is not something preformed. It's not something that immigrants carried with them in their baggage or even their cultural baggage to the United States. It was created in America through contest and through conflict and through negotiation, especially in the great urban centers of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and elsewhere. And I firmly believe, actually, that there will be an Irish America 50 years from now. It just won't be the Irish America that we're growing nostalgic about in 2026.
That's a great place to finish, because I'm hoping that virtual versions of us will meet in 250 years' time to have a discussion about
Indeed.
Irish America. Until
No
that
problem.
time, Kevin Kenny, I want to thank you very much indeed.
That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Kevin for joining, sharing his insights on Irish immigration to the US in the long 19th century and beyond.
You can follow this series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple, YouTube. You can follow us on social media, whether it would be Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube again, or the Clinton Institute. Give them a follow on all your favorite places to get latest news and information.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review.
We'll be back next week with a conversation on the role of race relations in Irish settlement and advancement in America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute, UCD, and produced, with our thanks, by Michelle May.